Our Centre for Disability Law and Policy in Galway came together with LEAP, which is a family leadership organisation, and together we started to identify a couple of key stakeholders that were really important in this process. So either brokerage services like Áisina Takiíochta that were providing this kind of link for families themselves and people with disabilities themselves who had already started to have their own system of direct payments. So in coming together, we wanted to produce a research project that was actually practical, useful, meaningful for families, because in Ireland right now we have no nationally comprehensive system of self-directed living in terms of funding or support structures. We wanted to show that even within this system, there are people doing it right now for themselves. So we don't have to wait for new law or new policy or new practice. I mean, it would be great when those things come, but we can do it right now. We don't have to wait. So that was really the goal of the project. And we wanted to find real stories of people living the good life with a combination of supports in a way that they would describe as self-directed living. So we made sure it was cross-disability, and we also made sure to have a good age range of the people whose lives and whose stories were shared in the project. So from quite young children up until adults in their 30s, 40s and beyond, we had a range of stories and experiences so that anyone could pick up this report and look at it and think, oh, well, this might be relevant to me in my life or my family member. And there would be a focus on what started to make things work. So that was really important. We could tell the war stories all day of the systems that failed and the things that went wrong. And it's important not to be naive and know that things do go wrong, especially when you throw out the rule book and you think about what does the good life look like. But they're more valuable things to be learned from those mistakes than to stay within the perceived safety of a segregated system. So that's what we really tried to achieve with the project. And we collected, in the report, we've documented 10 stories of individuals and families from a range of disabilities, a range of locations and geographic settings, urban, rural, and so on, and a range of age ranges. So with these different experiences. And out of that, we tried to locate it within the existing policy context, what's going to happen next, and also to try to set some boundaries or ground rules for any new national system of support to underpin self-directed living and to think about what people want from that system. So to do that, we held a series of workshops with people and families to get them to articulate what a system of support would look like and what were the things they wanted from a national system like that. So thinking about transparency and accountability, flexibility, responsiveness, creativity, trusting families, trusting people when they said that this was what they want. So those are the kinds of ingredients which all make sense and all have been identified in many other research projects, but need to be articulated at a particular moment in time in Ireland right now before we do introduce any sort of national resource allocation system or any kind of model of direct payments or individual budgets. So there's a lot of different factors that we look at when we think about what makes a success story in self-directed living. One of the things that's clearly really important is the involvement of strong family networks and good community support. So in some of the examples that we identified in a report that we wrote for this project called Good Lives were the involvement of neighbours, friends, the extended family network in thinking creatively about new solutions, different things that could be done, and a way to really include the person in their local community rather than thinking about segregated services or special services for that person. So that would be one really key thing, I guess, that we identified as being important. It can be sometimes. So for some of the families that we worked with to produce this report, they had managed to get some individualised funding, but other people hadn't. Other people were relying on the only income they might have had might be the person's disability allowance, for example, or they might have had, they had independent resources themselves as a family that they could put together that would form part of that person's support. So what we really learned in this project was that it wasn't that the funding itself, the money wasn't the core of it, and it helped when you had it, but there were, creative ways to get it and creative things to do with it, and that was more important than just the focus on how much the person might be entitled to in terms of, financial income. Right, exactly. So this was the concern that by having, the focus on the funding and the assessment of need for that funding, that's where all the energy goes, rather than thinking about what is a good life for that person and how can we get there and what resources can we mobilise as a family, as a community around this person that we inherently have, and what can we put together with that in terms of whatever financial income might be available to actually realise this vision of a good life. But it's the vision and the actualisation of it that's important and not the focus on the funds. Yeah, so I think a lot of that is the sort of inherent vested interests that exist in keeping the status quo alive, and the fear that people and families have about the uncertainty of the unknown, which is exactly what a self-directed living process is. It is an unknown, uncertain thing. So they're clear barriers, but also, there are other systemic barriers, even for the families that have managed to get their hands on some pot of funding, or who have managed to do things differently and stay out of segregated services. They've encountered a lot of questioning of their choices. They've come in contact with social services and health and social care services a lot, and felt very much undermined for the choices that they were trying to support family members to make, or the choices that they as disabled people were making. So there are clearly barriers within the existing system that don't allow these kind of creative processes to happen, but there's still managed to be loopholes. So people have still managed to kind of get past that. And sometimes, one of the stories in the report is a woman who managed to agree creativity in a funding arrangement because the person she used to deal with was on leave, and it was somebody else who was in the health service who said, okay, that sounds like you can try that, let's see what happens. So all of these, strange kind of coincidences can actually, make a huge difference in terms of the thinking. And once you've proven that it's effective and it works, then it's much more difficult for the bureaucracy to mobilise against you once you've a proven track record and you've shown that you can be trusted in how you actually manage this process. Yeah, I think mostly by peer-to-peer efforts, and I think that's probably the most effective way for family and individual leadership to be fostered. So LEAP, which is a family leadership organisation and part of the project, has done amazing work on a peer-to-peer level with families. What I thought was really important about this project was that people with physical and sensory disabilities who had been using personal assistance for a long time came into the process and shared their experience with the families and people with learning disability who, and autism and other kinds of disabilities, who hadn't heard that story or that journey of how that other generation of activists managed to achieve personal assistance and that as a form of self-directed living. So I think that was a really valuable exchange, and I think that could be carried forward, in other ways as well. And in our project, for example, we didn't reach out to people with mental health experience and to think about what would personalisation look like in that context, or what does self-directed living look like there, and does it involve any of these systems that we've been thinking about in the learning disability context. And it could have great relevance for older people as well, and people with dementia, and other disabilities that we could be sharing that learning with. So this was for us just the first step to try to start some of those conversations across disability and across different generations of people and activists who have some experience, and we can certainly broaden that out, we would hope, in the future. Yeah, I think, the best people to identify the mechanisms that work are the people and families who are actually doing this and who are leading the way in terms of self-directed living. How can that be promoted and fostered at a more national or in a more coordinated way? There's lots of mechanisms potentially for doing that. One of the ones which we didn't focus so much on in the report, but it's an area which I'm very actively involved in, is the legal capacity reform that's happening in Ireland right now. So the introduction of legally binding support agreements of different kinds of support agreements could be a really important mechanism to foster this at a more general level. It provides a level of formality for people who choose that, and not everyone will want to formalise their relationship or their support in that way. But for people who need maybe third parties to respect that and might be encountering some barriers in getting respect for the mechanism of support that they use in their lives, this could be a really helpful way to do that. We have to be really careful to make sure that in the final draft of this legislation that it is truly accessible and flexible and responsive to the people who need it most. There are some concerns, and I would have concerns about the proposals being put forward right now, that they require too high a level of cognitive functioning from people who can certainly identify those that they trust in their lives and certainly identify the issues that they want support on, but may not pass these kinds of stringent assessments or tests of mental capacity, which we seem to be so concerned with in the legal system. So I think that there's still a lot of work to be done there to make sure that we develop a flexible legal response and a mechanism for formalising these kinds of relationships where people choose that. I think that we also, need to think about, and this has been an ongoing conversation in Ireland for, at least a decade now, a system of funding. Even though I keep saying that funding is not the only important thing, it is still a factor in how people, choose and purchase supports that facilitate that vision of a good life that they hold for themselves. So in thinking about what resource allocation system is going to be introduced in Ireland, and thinking about the models and mechanisms for facilitating direct payments and brokerage, how accessible are those going to be to people and families? How much pressure are they going to put on families to carry the burden of managing quite complex financial and legal arrangements without providing the necessary support and guidance to people to navigate that whole process? These are all things that we still need to resolve, and we're at a moment now where it's possible to have conversations about this before we set in stone a system that we discover is not workable. And there's a lot of learning we can do from all of the other countries around the world that have been engaged in this process for so many years, and we can learn from things that have gone wrong in different contexts and try to avoid them, hopefully. So those are the two, I guess, big legal systems and policy frameworks that still need to be hammered out in order to facilitate and underpin a system of self-directed living.